When an avoidant begins to act distant or cold, most people instinctively interpret that shift as a loss of interest. It feels logical. After all, in most relational dynamics, emotional withdrawal signals disengagement. But with avoidant individuals, that assumption often leads you in the wrong direction. What you're witnessing is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of emotional intensity that exceeds their internal capacity to process it in real time. Avoidants don't experience less emotion. They experience it in a way that feels destabilizing, where others might lean into connection to regulate those feelings. Avoidants tend to do the opposite. They withdraw, not because they don't care, but because caring activates a level of vulnerability they've spent a lifetime learning to suppress. Their distance is not indifference. It's a form of emotional self-regulation, albeit an imperfect one. To understand this, you have to step into their psychological framework. For an avoidant, closeness is not purely comforting. It's also threatening. Intimacy creates exposure, and exposure creates risk. The deeper the emotional bond becomes, the more it challenges their sense of independence and internal control. So when feelings intensify, their instinct is not to move closer, but to create space, to regain equilibrium. This is where the confusion begins for the other person, because from the outside, it looks cold. It feels like rejection. The warmth that once existed suddenly disappears, replaced by silence, shorter responses, or emotional unavailability. And naturally, you start questioning everything: what changed, what you did wrong, whether the connection was ever real to begin with. But internally, something very different is happening. The avoidant is not disengaging. They are overwhelmed. They are thinking, analyzing, and often replaying interactions in their mind, trying to make sense of feelings that don't come naturally to them. Where someone secure might express affection or seek reassurance, the avoidant retreats into their internal world, attempting to process emotions without losing their sense of control. And control is the key word here, because for avoidance, control equals safety. Emotional dependence feels like a loss of control, and that loss is deeply uncomfortable. So distance becomes their way of reestablishing that balance. It gives them the illusion of stability, even if it creates instability in the relationship itself. There's also a deeper philosophical layer to this. Avoidants often operate under an internal belief, sometimes conscious, often not, that vulnerability leads to pain. This belief isn't arbitrary. It's usually rooted in past experiences where emotional openness was met with disappointment, neglect, or inconsistency. Over time, they adapt by minimizing their emotional exposure. They don't stop feeling, they just stop expressing. So when you enter their life and create a genuine emotional impact, it disrupts that carefully constructed system. You become significant, and significance to an avoidant is both desired and feared. They want the connection, but they also fear what it demands of them. That internal conflict is what you're seeing when they go cold. It's not a calculated move. It's not a strategy to manipulate or confuse you. It's a reflex, a deeply ingrained response to emotional intensity. They step back, not because they've decided you don't matter, but because in that moment you matter too much for them to handle comfortably. This doesn't mean their behavior is healthy. It doesn't mean it's fair. And it certainly doesn't mean you should accept inconsistency as a form of love. But it does mean that if you're trying to understand their distance, you have to move beyond surface-level interpretations. Because the truth is, what feels like rejection is often a mismanaged response to attachment. And that distinction matters. It shifts the narrative from "they don't care" to They don't know how to handle caring. It doesn't excuse the impact of their behavior, but it clarifies the source of it. Once you understand that, you stop personalizing their distance in a way that erodes your self-worth. You begin to see it as a limitation in their emotional framework, not a reflection of your value. And that awareness is powerful because it allows you to respond with clarity instead of confusion, with grounded understanding instead of emotional reactivity. At the end of the day, an avoidance distance is not a void, it's a signal that something real has been activated within them, something they are not yet equipped to face directly. And the most important thing to remember is this: their inability to process deep emotion is not proof that it doesn't exist, it's proof that it doesn't. What makes the avoidant dynamic particularly disorienting is this paradox. The very moment you begin to feel their distance most intensely is often the moment they begin to think about you the most. It seems counterintuitive, even contradictory. How can someone appear so detached on the outside while being mentally preoccupied on the inside? But this is precisely how the avoidant mind tends to operate. When you are physically present, when the connection is immediate, emotional and alive, and avoidant is managing stimulation in real time. There is eye contact, expectation, emotional exchange. All of this requires responsiveness, and responsiveness requires vulnerability. For someone who is not comfortable with vulnerability, this can feel like standing too close to a fire. Even if the warmth is pleasant, the intensity becomes overwhelming. So they regulate by pulling back, becoming quieter, less expressive, sometimes even cold. But when you are no longer there, when the interaction ends, when the messages stop, when the space between you grows, that intensity disappears. And in its place, something unexpected happens. Clarity, the pressure to respond is gone. The need to protect themselves in the moment dissolves. And now, in that quieter psychological space, their mind begins to wander back to you. They replay conversations, they analyze your words, they revisit subtle details, your tone, your expressions, the way you made them feel, and unlike in the moment, where they might have suppressed their emotional responses, now those feelings have room to surface, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but gradually, almost analytically. It's less about expression and more about reflection. This is why absence affects an avoidant differently than it affects someone with a more secure attachment style. For a secure person, connection thrives in presence. For an avoidant, connection often becomes clearer in absence. Distance creates the emotional safety they need to engage with their own feelings without feeling exposed. And this is where many people misinterpret the situation. You experience their distance and assume disinterest. You see the lack of communication and conclude that you've been forgotten. But internally, the opposite can be unfolding. You occupy their thoughts in a way that is quiet but persistent, not always consciously acknowledged, but present nonetheless. This doesn't mean they will act on those thoughts, and that's an important distinction. Thinking about you and reaching out to you are not the same thing. Feeling something and expressing it are not the same thing. Avoidants often live in that gap between internal experience and external behavior. Philosophically, this speaks to a deeper human tendency, the separation between awareness and action. Just because someone becomes aware of their feelings doesn't mean they are ready to translate that awareness into vulnerability. For avoidance, that translation is where the real difficulty lies. So they think, they process, they circle back to you in their zuin, especially during moments of solitude, late at night during quiet routines, in the spaces where distraction fades. You become a kind of unresolved presence, not because they are intentionally holding on, but because the connection activated something meaningful that hasn't been fully integrated. And yet, from your perspective, none of this is visible. All you see is the silence. And silence, when you don't understand its origin, can feel like indifference. It can trigger self-doubt, overanalysis, the urge to reach out and fill the gap. But this is where perspective becomes essential. Because if you rely only on external behavior to interpret an avoidant, you will almost always misunderstand them. Their internal world does not mirror their external actions in a straightforward way. In fact, it often contradicts it. This is not to romanticize their distance or to suggest that you should wait for someone who cannot show up consistently. It's to clarify the psychological reality behind the behavior, so you are not building conclusions on incomplete information. Because the truth is, you can be deeply present in someone's mind and still absent from their actions. You can matter to someone who is not capable of demonstrating that in a way that feels secure or reliable. And that realization requires a certain level of emotional maturity to hold. It asks you to accept complexity without losing your sense of self, to understand that being thought about is not the same as being chosen, that occupying someone's dhihn is not the same as occupying a stable place in their life. Avoidants often think about you more when you're not around because distance removes the immediate threat of vulnerability. It allows them to feel without reacting, to reflect without exposing. But reflection alone does not build connection. Action does. And that's the line you have to remain aware of. Because at the end of the day, it's not about how often someone thinks of you in your absence. It's about whether they can show up for you in your presence. And that is the difference between being remembered and being truly valued. What often gets misunderstood at this stage is the meaning people assign to cold behavior. We are conditioned to read warmth as care and distance as disinterest. So when someone becomes emotionally unavailable, less expressive, or even indifferent in tone, the immediate conclusion is simple. They must not feel the same way anymore. But with avoidance, that interpretation is not only incomplete, it's often inaccurate. Because what looks like a lack of love is frequently a defense against it. Avoidants don't shut down because there is nothing there. They shut down because there is something there, and it feels unsafe to express. Vulnerability for them is not a neutral act. It carries psychological weight. It implies exposure, loss of control, and the possibility of being hurt in ways they have not learned to navigate effectively. So instead of leaning into emotional openness, they instinctively move in the opposite direction. They minimize, they detach, they create emotional distance, not as a reflection of how little they feel, but as a strategy to manage how much they feel. This is where the concept of defense mechanisms becomes essential. A defense mechanism is not a conscious decision. It's an automatic psychological response designed to protect the individual from perceived threat. In the case of avoidance, the threat is not the other person. It's the internal experience of vulnerability itself. When feelings deepen, something in them signals danger, not because love is inherently dangerous, but because, in their internal blueprint, emotional closeness has been associated with discomfort, inconsistency, or even pain. So the mind steps in to regulate that discomfort by reducing emotional exposure. And it does this efficiently. They may become quieter, less affectionate, slower to respond. Conversations that once flowed easily start to feel strained or surface level. there is a subtle but noticeable shift in energy. And to the person on the receiving end, it feels confusing at best and painful at worst. But internally, this shift is not about you losing value. It's about them trying to maintain psychological equilibrium. There's a philosophical tension here worth understanding, the tension between connection and self-preservation. Every human being navigates this balance to some degree. We all want closeness, but we also want to feel safe. The difference is that avoidants prioritize safety over connection when the two seem to conflict. So, when emotional intimacy begins to require vulnerability, they interpret that requirement as a risk. And rather than confronting that risk directly, they reduce the intensity of the connection. This is why their behavior can feel so contradictory. At one moment, they are engaged, present, even deeply connected. And the next, they seem distant, detached, almost indifferent. It creates a kind of emotional inconsistency that is difficult to make sense of if you're expecting linear behavior. But from their perspective, it is consistent. They move closer when it feels manageable, and they pull away when it starts to feel overwhelming. The mistake many people make is personalizing that shift. They assume that if someone becomes cold, it must mean they've done something wrong, or that the connection wasn't meaningful. But in reality, the shift often says more about the avoidant's internal limits than it does about the relationship itself. This doesn't make the experience any less difficult. Me being on the receiving end of emotional withdrawal can trigger self-doubt, anxiety, and the urge to seek reassurance. You want to understand, to fix, to bring things back to how they were. But here's the critical point. You cannot resolve someone else's defense mechanism by offering more of what they are already overwhelmed by. In fact, the more you try to close the distance in response to their withdrawal, the more it can reinforce their need to create space. Not because your intentions are wrong, but because their system is not equipped to process that level of emotional intensity in that moment. This is where understanding becomes a form of power, not to change them, but to ground yourself. When you recognize that their coldness is protective rather than dismissive, you stop chasing explanations that lead nowhere. You stop internalizing behavior that was never about your worth to begin with. And at a deeper level, you begin to see the limitation clearly, because while their defense mechanism may protect them from discomfort, it also prevents them from fully participating in the connection. It keeps them at a distance, not just from you, but from their own emotional experience. So yes, their cold behavior may not mean they don't love. It may mean they are trying to defend themselves from the very feelings that love creates. But understanding that truth comes with a responsibility to not confuse hidden emotion with healthy connection. Because at the end of the day, love that cannot be expressed consistently will always feel like absence, no matter how deeply it exists beneath the surface. And that is the reality you have to hold on to. A guarded heart may still feel deeply, but if it cannot show up, it will always feel far away. If you follow the pattern closely enough, you begin to notice something that at first feels almost paradoxical. The moments when an avoidant pulls away are often the moments when the connection has started to matter the most. It's not random, it's not arbitrary, it's a response to a shift in emotional stakes. Because for an avoidant, closeness is never just about connection, it's also about control. And control in their internal world is synonymous with safety. As long as the relationship exists within a certain emotional range, light, manageable, undefined, they can engage without feeling threatened. There's enough distance to maintain their sense of independence. enough ambiguity to avoid feeling fully exposed. But the moment the connection deepens, the moment it begins to carry emotional weight, something changes internally. They start to feel the possibility of dependence, not necessarily in a dramatic or obvious way, but subtly. They notice that your presence affects them more than they expected, that your absence creates a kind of psychological disturbance, that your opinion, your attention, your consistency, these things begin to matter. And that's where the tension begins. Because while most people interpret that growing significance as a reason to move closer, an avoidant interprets it as a signal to regain distance, not because they don't value the connection, but because they feel themselves losing a degree of emotional autonomy. They are not comfortable surrendering. So they step back, not always consciously, not always with clear intent, but with a very specific psychological hadep to reestablish control over their internal state. Distance becomes a tool. It gives them room to think without influence, to feel without pressure, to recalibrate without the immediacy of interaction. It allows them to return to a version of themselves that feels less dependent, less exposed, less vulnerable. But here's where the deeper complexity lies. The very act of pulling away is often driven by the strength of what they feel, not the weakness of it. The more significant you become, the more they feel the need to create space. And this is what makes the dynamic so confusing for the other person. Because from your perspective, closeness should build continuity. It should lead to more consistency, more openness, more presence. But with an avoidant, increased closeness can trigger the opposite response. It can create interruption instead of progression. Philosophically, this speaks to a fundamental human conflict, the desire for connection versus the fear of losing oneself within it. Everyone navigates this to some extent, but avoidants experience this conflict more intensely and resolve it in a way that prioritizes self-protection. They are not just afraid of being hurt by someone else. They are afraid of what emotional closeness might require from them: dependence, vulnerability, emotional exposure. These are not neutral experiences in their system. They are perceived as risks to identity and control. So when those elements begin to surface, distance feels like the only way to stabilize. They may not articulate it this way. In fact, most avoidants are not consciously aware of the depth of this pattern. They simply feel the urge to withdraw, to create space, to reduce intensity. And they follow that instinct because it brings immediate relief. But relief is not the same as resolution. Because while distance may restore their sense of control in the short term, it also disrupts the continuity of the relationship. It creates gaps, inconsistencies, emotional uncertainty. And over time, those gaps accumulate into something that becomes difficult to sustain. From your side, it can feel like you're constantly adjusting, trying to find the right balance between closeness and distance, trying not to trigger their withdrawal, trying to maintain connection without overwhelming them. But that dynamic is inherently unstable because it places the responsibility of emotional regulation on you, while the underlying pattern remains unchanged on their side. And this is where clarity becomes essential. Understanding that their need for distance is tied to their need for control helps you stop misinterpreting their behavior as a reflection of your worth. It allows you to see the pattern for what it is, a coping mechanism, not a measure of how much you matter. But it also forces you to confront a more difficult truth, that someone can feel deeply, think about you constantly, and still not be able to sustain a stable, consistent connection. Because control, when prioritized above all else, limits intimacy, and intimacy requires a willingness to tolerate uncertainty, to remain present even when emotions are intense, to stay engaged even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. These are capacities that avoidants often have not fully developed. So they manage the relationship in the only way they know how, by regulating distance. They come closer when it feels safe. They pull away when it doesn't. And the cycle continues, not because the connection lacks meaning, but because it lacks stability. And that brings you to a defining realization. The depth of someone's feelings is not the same as their ability to maintain closeness. You can be important to someone who still needs to step away from you, to feel in control. You can matter deeply to someone who cannot stay consistently present